So this is one of the ex-OpenAI employees. He used to be part of the now disbanded super alignment team at OpenAI. He comes out and spills the beans on what's been happening. His name is Leopold Aschenbrenner. This was on the Dwarkesh Patel podcast. And first and foremost, I got to say, I was kind of blown away by this guy's knowledge, his ability to think intelligently through things. He seems to know a little bit about everything, and he has a lot of deep knowledge into AI. And the way he's able to explain it is, I gotta say, very interesting. Definitely an excellent podcast to watch. I highly recommend it. It's like 4.5 hours long. It's no joke, but it is very good, very informative, very educational. And one thing that I really liked is I don't think this guy is necessarily pushing some narrative. He seems to be open to ideas and just in general seems to know quite a bit. Let me give you some of the highlights from this podcast that really jumped out at me. But the bigger point in all of this is this series, this paper that he published called Situational Awareness, the Decade Ahead. There's a lot of things that we talked about on this channel that are very close to what this paper is talking about. First of all, where are we in this progress to AGI? What is GPT-4? Was it the sparks of AGI, as the Microsoft paper put it? And then from AGI to superintelligence, what does that look like? Do we have decades before we have to worry about a superintelligence emerging? Is it rapidly going to expand? And of course, and this is where we get into the really scary stuff, but also the really interesting stuff. And this is where I gotta say my hat's off to this guy, because if you take a look at these things on the screen, right, super alignment is this idea of, will AI just kill everybody? Next chapter is the free world must prevail. So this idea of, will some governments be able to create dictatorships with the help of AGI? What does this mean for democracy? What does this mean for, jobs and money in the economy? What does this mean for how the world works, basically, right? We've talked about some of these things on this channel, but one very frustrating thing, to me at least, has been that, for example, people that are, let's say, AI doomers, that believe that AI is dangerous, should be shut down, don't really talk about the other dangers. What happens if we pause, but certain other nations don't pause? Or what happens if, for example, we give full control of AI to the government, any government, and then later that government gets corrupted and we run into a 1984-like scenario? Feels like most people kind of have their own little perspective, their own bias, and then they think one or two steps ahead. Very few people I've seen have really zoomed out and looked at the whole picture. So my hat is really off to this guy in a sense that he is doing that as somebody that's very deep inside the research, as somebody that's very knowledgeable across the board around both hardware and software and theories and applications. He's laying out all of the things that could potentially be an issue. So as we look into this, understand this, whether or not you agree with what he's saying, whether or not you think he's right, everything that he's talked about has to be talked about and decided at some point. We all have our pet issues, right? Some of us want to pause AI because we're concerned with an X risk. Some of us want space communism, as it's called, right? Where everything's automated and we get to kick back and enjoy life, kind of a Star Trek-like scenario. Some of us are looking forward to making some money during this transition as AI kind of emerges into the world, being first movers, etc. So we all have our little pet causes that we're working towards. But if you assume that AI will keep getting better and better, a lot of these scary questions have to be answered. But we'll come back to that in just a second. One of the things that I've been struggling with, and I know a lot of you that have mentioned this in the comments have been struggling with as well, is this idea of, like, if you're trying to build agents or some sort of AI applications, where do you come in? Because it seems like the newer versions that come out tend to kind of destroy a lot of these startups, a lot of the wrappers that come before it. Here's kind of how he puts it.
But I think in some sense, the way a lot of these systems want to be integrated is you kind of get this sort of sonic boom where it's, the sort of intermediate systems could have done it, but it would take in Schlep. And before you do the Schlep to integrate them, you get much more powerful systems that are sort of unhobbled. And so they're this agent and there's drop-in remote worker. And, and then you're kind of interacting with them like a coworker, right? You can do Zoom calls with them and you're slacking them and you're like, can you do this project? And then they go off and they, go away for a week and write a first draft and get feedback on them and, run tests on their code. And then they come back and
So the point here is that if you're using GPT-4 to build an agent, it has certain limitations. It has certain things that aren't quite right, that it's not quite getting. And whenever a newer version comes out that's better, smarter, and just it's more intelligent, it's more flexible, it learns stuff. A lot of what he calls Schlep, I guess, is like all this troubleshooting and tinkering with it Well, all those things are solved by the next iteration of the AI. Next, we talk about system 2 thinking, which is basically long-term planning, things like mathematics. So kind of like the more deep and complex stuff. That's something that we humans can do, for example, and that a lot of animals really can't.
I think it's the brute force way to get to kind of agents. You just improve that sort of system. But if you can get that system 2 working, then, I think you could like quite quickly jump, to sort of this like more agentified, test time compute overhang is unlocked.
What's the reason to think that this is an easy win in the sense that, you just get there's like some loss function that easily enables you to train it to enable the system 2 thinking.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of animals that have system 2 thinking, it like took a long time for evolution to give us system 2 thinking. That pre-training it, like, listen, I get it. You got like trillions of tokens of internet text. I get that, like, you like match that and you get all this free training capabilities. What's the reason to think that this has been easy unhobbling?
By unhobbling, they just mean kind of unlocking these capabilities, or he talks about it a little bit more in his paper, which we'll cover later.
It gave us this huge advantage for models of general intelligence. First of all, free training is magical, right?
Yeah.
And it gave us this huge advantage for models of general intelligence because you just predict the next token, but predicting the next token, I mean, it's sort of a common misconception. But what it does is it lets this model learn these incredibly rich representations, right? Like these sort of representation learning properties are the magic of deep learning. You have these models, and instead of learning just kind of like, whatever, statistical artifacts or whatever, it learns sort of these models of the world. That's also why they can kind of like generalize, right? Because it learned the right representations.
Sure.
And so,
this is kind of a big thing. And I know it's a little bit maybe complicated how he's saying it, but one study that I like to point to that kind of, I think, really easily illustrates this is this Harvard study called Beyond Surface Statistics, where they take this AI model and it starts out completely blank, right? And they feed it a bunch of 2D images of cars, images of people and boats and streets and whatever you can think of, until it's able to create those images, to create images of cars and boats and streets and people and animals, etc. Now, keep in mind that we're not really teaching it to do anything. We're not saying, this is how you draw a car, you draw the wheels or whatever, right? No, we just feed it images and then it just kind of gets it. Kind of like a black box. A lot of people refer to it as a black box. We put data in one side and out comes these predictive abilities, this inference, its ability to create, images and text and video and all sorts of stuff that we find valuable. That's what AI is. These neural nets align themselves in such a way to output various valuable things for us. And we don't fully understand how all that stuff works, but in this particular study, they decided to use they call it probes. So basically trying to look into the model's quote unquote brain as it's generating these images to see kind of what's happening, which portions are getting activated. And they found something weird. So keep in mind, this model started as a blank slate, and then it was fed a bunch of 2D images. So it doesn't really know what these 2D images are. It's just a bunch of pixels on a screen. So when you look at this thing right here, right, it's a car, right? You can probably imagine what this car looks like from the other side because you've seen that thing in real life in the 3D space. These models haven't. They have no concept of 3D or depth. All they've ever seen in their life are 2D images of these various objects. And yet, when they get good at drawing these objects, we go in and try to see how they're creating these images. These are what's called diffusion models. So basically, the way they generate images is they kind of start with this kind of static, noisy image where you can't really tell what it is, and they slowly sort of denoise it into an image of something. And that's just the nature of how they're trained, right? It's a different sort of model than what's used for large language models, for example, LLMs. A lot of the image models, they're diffusion models. So this is kind of how they form these images. But this interesting thing happens where before you or I can guess what's in these images, or even before another AI model could potentially predict what's in these images, that model has a certain representation of what it's drawing as it's drawing it out. And so in this first image here, you'll notice that the deep red is things that are closer to the camera, and the blue is things that are in the background. So red is foreground, and then the further away you go, it kind of gets yellow, and then further you go, it gets deep blue. So as you can see here, before you can even recognize what this image is, right, probably by the time you get here, you can kind of begin to recognize this as a car, maybe by step 3 or 4, right, as the details emerge. So before we even know what the image looks like, we know that whatever is drawing has this round thing kind of closer to us in the foreground, right? And then this is the background, so maybe the trees or the sky or whatever. And this paper asks, even when these models are trained purely in images without any depth information, right? They typically output coherent pictures of 3D scenes. How is that possible? And what they find is that these models do have some sort of a 3D representation. They have some sort of a distinction between the background and the salient object, the object that the picture is about, right? And these representations appear surprisingly early in the denoising process, so that the process of going through that noisy image that you can't tell what it is to an actual picture of the car or whatever else. So what this kind of is implying, and there's other studies into this that show this, Dr. Jim Fan from NVIDIA talked about this with the SOAR models, is that these models learn implicitly. We show them a bunch of 2D images and we say, learn to create these images. And they figure out like, okay, it looks like in order to create these images, I have to understand 3D space. So it creates a sort of mental model of what 3D space looks like. And then using that and other things, it's then able to create images that are coherent in the 3D space, right? They look like real images of the world that we see out there in 3D space. That's a little bit weird, right? Kind of blew my mind the first time I was able to kind of grasp what that means. And that's literally what he's saying right here.
You have these models, and instead of learning just kind of like, whatever, statistical artifacts or whatever, it learns through these models of the world. That's also why they can kind of like generalize, right? Because it learned the right representations.
Sure. Right. The right representations. Another word for it is world models. And that's what he means, I think, when he says it's magical, right? It's this idea that we stumbled upon this thing that we didn't really know existed at the start of his paper, Situational Awareness, somewhere here. So it's dedicated to Ilya Sutskever. And somewhere here, he had a quote about, or rather from Ilya Sutskever. And it's this. Ilya said, look, these models, they just want to learn. You have to understand this. The models, they just want to learn. And so that's the first big step that allowed us to create these AI models, is this near magical thing called, pre-training or implicit learning that these neural nets had. Sam Altman at some point said that it seems like intelligence might be an emergent function of physics, I think he said. So it's not like this crazy engineered thing that we have to piece together. It's almost like kind of emerges. It's there when we have certain things present. So tons of data, these neural nets trained towards some outcome, create what we think of as intelligence. And it's not just humans and animals and other things, living things that has it. It can be sand and metal and whatever. As long as you're able to create that environment, intelligence emerges in it. Again, kind of weird, right? And then the next step that we do is we do RLHF, reinforcement learning of human feedback, right? That's when we go, good job, when it does something right, or we go, boo, that's wrong, when it does something wrong. And over time, it adjusts its answers, its outputs, based on that to be a little bit more closer to what we wanted to do. So ChatGPT was RLHF'd, right? So it went through that process to act like a helpful assistant. Initially, if you play with the original model, the base model, it doesn't really function like that. It doesn't really get how the back and forth works. If you say hi, you'll try to complete the thing that it thinks should come next based on the internet and every book that it's read. Once I accidentally installed Llama's base model instead of the chatbot, the instruction tune model, and I said hi just to test to see if it works, and went hi, hello, greetings, good morning, good day, and it just continued writing out like dozens and dozens of greetings because it thought that was the statistically likely answer based on the stuff that it saw out there in the world and the data. Instead of knowing that, no, when I say hi, you should say, hello there, how can I help? Or something like that, right? It wasn't trained to do that yet.
You pre-train these models and you have this sort of like raw bundle of capabilities that's really useful. And sort of this almost unformed raw math. And sort of the unhobbling we've done over sort of like GPT-2 to GPT-4 was you kind of took this sort of like raw mass and then you like RLHF'd it into a really good chatbot. And that was a huge win, right? Like, going, in the original, I think, InstructGPT paper, RLHF versus non-RLHF model, it's like 100x model size win on sort of human preference rating. It started to be able to do like simple chain of thought and so on. But you still have a disadvantage of all these kind of like raw capabilities. And I think there's still like a huge amount that you're not doing with them.
All right. So he's basically saying that like, yeah, we create this raw mass of intelligence that's kind of useless. It's very powerful, but it's not very useful. Similar to that llama that just kept saying, hi, hello, hi there, like 50 million times. That's not useful. I wanted to say, greetings, how can I help, right? Because that's something that would be useful to me. How do we unlock that usefulness? Well, RLHF is one of those potential approaches, but there's got to be others, right? And this is where, and he doesn't use these words, but If you recall that whole Q-star leak, which was a confirmed leak, we just don't know the specific thing it was from, what was the actual project details, but we knew that the leak was actually real. But after listening to a lot of the people that are knowledgeable in the industry, kind of their guess at what Q-star was is this idea of combining the AI approach of OpenAI and large language models to what, for example, AlphaStar is doing. So DeepMind's technology, this ability to self-play, to self kind of teach itself to do stuff. But I think the question is, can we have the AI teach itself to kind of what he's like unhobble or unpack that raw intelligence, that raw ability to AlphaGo, AlphaStar, all those things, how it taught itself to have superhuman ability at things like chess, StarCraft, things like Go, for example, the game of Go. It taught itself by playing millions of games or billions of games against each other in a very rapid succession. It got better and better and better through self-play. It improved itself. Can large language models improve themselves? So if we give it the pre-training, that raw mass, can we then combine that with something that AlphaGo did, for example, to create this self-improvement process? Could it be that that's what AlphaStar was? Could it be that that's what Q-star was? He doesn't talk about that, but this idea gets talked about quite a bit in this field.
You're actually not being pre-trained anymore. You're not being pre-trained anymore. You were pre-trained in like grade school and high school. At some point, you transitioned to being able to like learn by yourself, right? You weren't able to do that in elementary school. I don't know, middle school probably. I mean, high school is maybe when it sort of started. You need some guidance. College, if you're smart, you can kind of teach yourself. What you do is you kind of like, you read a page, kind of think about it. You have some internal monologue going on. You have a conversation with a study buddy. You try a practice problem. You fail a bunch of times. And at some point it clicks. And then you're like, this made sense. Then you read a few more pages. And so we've kind of bootstrapped our way to being able to do that now with models, or like just starting to be able to do that. And then the question is, being able to like read it, think about it, try problems. And the question is, can you, all this sort of self-play synthetic data RL is kind of like making that thing work.
Yep.
So basically translating like in context, right? Like right now there's like in context learning, right? Super sample efficient. Yeah. There's that, in the Gemini paper, right? It just like learns a language in context. And then you have pre-training, not at all sample efficient.
So we talked about the Gemini paper where basically after it was pre-trained, so the model's ready, then it was given a bunch of study materials, and then it was able to learn this language. I forget, it was like a very unknown language that didn't have a lot of internet presence, almost zero internet presence. It was, I think, a few dozen people in the world spoke it, or maybe like a few hundred, like a very small amount. And it was able to learn how to speak that language. So that was in context learning. So I think the point that he's making is, so we went from pre-training and having it be a little bit like a middle schooler, we had to feed it knowledge for it to get it, to now it's getting into the area where it's a little bit more maybe like a smart high school student or a college student that is now able to teach themselves. You give them the study material and it goes through it, it thinks about it, kind of reasons, has this internal monologue, and then it learns something new. So the reason this is important is because the growth in AI isn't just happening because of the increase in scale in compute and how much data we can feed it. We're also learning to give it these improvements in its ability to think, to learn, as Leopold is putting unhobble, which kind of means to take away a limitation, right? So it's limited and we're taking that limitation away. That's important to understand because both of those things are sort of compounding. They're both improving the technology, one in just sort of the raw abilities and the other in almost how well it can apply those raw abilities, that raw intelligence, how useful it is.
Right. So it's like you have this baseline, just enormous force of scaling, right? Where it's like GPT-2 to GPT-4, GPT-2, it could kind of like, it was amazing, right? It could string together plausible sentences, but it could barely do anything. It was kind of like preschooler. And then GPT-4 is, it's writing code. It like, can do hard math. And so it's sort of like smart high schooler. And so this big jump, and, in sort of the essay series, I go through and kind of count the orders of magnitude of compute scale up, of algorithmic progress. And so sort of scaling alone, sort of by 27, 28 is going to do another kind of preschool to high school jump on top of GPT-4. And so that'll already be just like at a per token level, just incredibly smart. That'll get you some more reliability. And then you add these unhobblings that make it look much less like a chatbot, more like this agent, like a drop-in remote worker. That's when things really get going.
That's when things really get going. And next he's talking about where this is going. So Dwarkesh is asking, okay, so when is this going to hit the normal people, the everyday people? How is this going to interact with the economy? And here's the answer. Now, I don't know what he's thinking, but I do feel like he's really trying hard not to say, feel the AGI. He wants to say it, but he's really trying hard not to say it.
And I mean, I think a lot more people are going to feel it, right? I mean, I think I think 2023 was the sort of moment for me where it went from kind of AGI as a sort of theoretical abstract thing, and you'd make the models to like, I see it, I feel it, and like, I see the path, see where it's going. I think I can see the cluster where it's trained on, like the rough combination of algorithms, the people, like how it's happening. Yeah. And I think, most of the world is not, most of the people feel it are like right here, right? But I think a lot more of the world is going to start feeling it. And I think that's going to start being kind of intense.
So a lot more of the world is going to start feeling it, feeling the AGI. I think he purposely didn't say those exact words, but that's what he's talking about. And so briefly coming back to what we talked about earlier about like, where do you come in and build on top of these models if you're building something like a wrapper, an AI wrapper, ChatGPT wrapper? So does he think those will do well?
Twitter and there's these GPT wrapper companies like, whoa, GPT-4o is going to change our business.
I'm so bearish on the wrapper companies, right? Because like they're the ones that are going to be like the wrapper companies are betting on stagnation, right? The wrapper companies are betting like you have these intermediate models and it takes so much left to integrate them. And I'm kind of like, I'm really bearish because I'm like, we're just going to sonic boom you, and we're going to get the unhobblings, we're going to get the drop-in remote worker, and then, your stuff is not going to matter.
Okay, sure.
Yikes, that's an interesting way of putting it. Like all these people that are trying to create the wrappers won't matter, will be obsolete because you're going to have the drop-in remote worker, which by the way, that's literally what Jensen Huang was talking about on stage with VIMs. So he was talking about these whole department of AI agents that are capable of doing whatever you want them to do, whether in biotech or gaming and customer service. You kind of just drop in them into whatever enterprise needs them, whatever infrastructure they're running. This is in the cloud, it's all through the API. So no matter what you're doing, you just get this thing, and they kind of imagine it as this cube that contains everything that you need, all the AI models and whatever you need text to speech. So for customer service, if you need somebody to answer the phones, hook up into your infrastructure to answer customer service tickets, refund orders, check on what's being shipped, whatever you need is just this cube thing that gets dropped in, gets plugged into your system. And that's kind of what Leopold is saying here, this drop-in remote worker. Only instead of a worker, it's just the whole department, perhaps. And so this is where we get to kind of like the real stuff, the stuff that a lot of people don't talk about, right? Because off the top of my head, I can give you a few people that are talking about AI bringing about utopia, some sort of an extremely great outcome. And also off the top of my head, I can name a few doomers that think that is going to just wipe everything off the face of the earth and that we should pause it immediately. But probably like most things, there's a bit of a middle path there. There's a bit of a nuance of what could happen. And the big question is, as AI becomes more powerful, do you believe that nations will just sit back and let it develop without any sort of input, that these superpowers will just kind of let it run amok? And if you don't think that's the case, then what will they do about it?
What happens? Yeah. Like, what is the sort of political reaction immediately?
Yeah.
And even like internationally, like what people see, like right now, I don't know if like Xi Jinping like reads the news and sees like,
I don't know.
GPT-4o, oh my God, like an MMLU score on that. What are we doing about this, comrade?
And just a quick aside, somebody made this comment on that video. I gotta say, it's just spot on.
Yeah, I don't know.
GPT-4o, oh my God, like an MMLU score on that. What are we doing about this, comrade? So what happens when the GPT, he's like sees a remote replacement and it has $100 billion in revenue. There's a lot of businesses that have $100 billion in revenue and people aren't staying up all night talking about it.
I think the question is when does the CCP and when does the sort of American national security establishment realize that superintelligence is going to be absolutely decisive for national power, right? And this is where, the sort of intelligence explosion stuff comes in, which, we should also talk about later. It's sort of like, you have AGI, you have this sort of drop-in remote worker that can replace, you or me, at least that sort of remote jobs, cognitive jobs. And then, I think fairly quickly, by default, you turn the crank, one or two more times, and then you get a thing that's smarter than humans. But I think even more than just turning the crank a few more times, I think one of the first jobs to be automated is going to be that of sort of an AI researcher engineer. And if you can automate AI research, I think things can start going very fast. Right now there's already this trend of, half an order of magnitude a year of algorithmic progress. Suppose, at this point, you're going to have GPU fleets in the tens of millions for inference, or more. And, you're going to be able to run like 100 million human equivalents of these sort of automated AI researchers. And if you can do that, you can maybe do, a decade's worth of sort of ML research progress in a year. You get this some sort of 10x speed up. And if you can do that, I think you can make the jump to kind of like AI that is vastly smarter than humans, within a year, couple years. And then, that broadens, right? So you have this sort of initial acceleration of AI research that broadens to like you apply R&D to a bunch of other fields of technology. And
so he describes that kind of virtuous cycle, this kind of flywheel effect of AI researching AI, this intelligence explosion, improving of robotics getting faster and better and more agile and stronger and cheaper and more resilient. We're already seeing it used in military applications. This isn't science fiction. Recently, we covered a story where over California, there were these modified F-16s, these jet fighter planes that were piloted by AI, that were doing various, simulated dogfights. Simulated as in they weren't shooting each other, but they were chasing each other, doing these various maneuvers. This was 2023, I think, when they started doing this. So if you live in California, there's a chance that at some point you'll have an F-16 flying over your head that's piloted by AI. Now, during that experiment, there was a human person in the cockpit kind of getting ready. He was ready to take over the control in case something failed, something malfunctioned. But the tests were successful. At no point did they have to take control. And by the way, even before they did it in real life, they did that in a video game simulation. So basically the exact same thing, only instead of a real physical plane in the sky, it was a video game, but it's perfectly simulated to where it's like almost exactly like flying a plane. And in those experiments, the AI pilots just destroyed the human pilots. So step one, are they better than human pilots? Check. Can they actually fly a real plane? Check. Without live fire weapons. So what's the next obvious step, do you think? It's fully autonomous AI F-16s flying around. They're vastly superior to human pilots. And we've been hearing and seeing more and more things come out of China with which just really seems like military applications, right? Those drones flying through the forest that we've covered a few weeks ago, I think. This drone swarm navigating through this bamboo forest very effectively, very quickly. And then Leopold is asking, okay, so fast forward a little bit in your mind. What do you think happens?
I think if you play this picture forward, I think it is fairly unlike any other technology in that it will, I think, a couple years of lead could be utterly decisive in, say, like military competition, right? If you look at like Gulf War I, right? Gulf War I, like the Western coalition forces, they had like 100-to-1 kill ratio, right? And that was like they had better sensors on their tanks, and they had better, more precision missiles, right? Like GPS, and they had stealth, and they had sort of a few, maybe 20, 30 years of technological lead, right? And they just completely crushed them. Superintelligence applied to sort of broad fields of R&D, and then the sort of industrial explosion as well. You have the robots, you're just making lots of material. I think that could compress. Basically compress kind of like a century worth of technological progress into less than a decade. And that means that a couple years could mean a sort of Gulf War I style like advantage in military affairs, including like a decisive advantage that even like preempts nukes, right? Suppose like how do you find the stealthy nuclear submarines? Like right now, that's a problem of like you have sensors, you have the software, like tracked where they are. You can do that. You can find them. You have kind of like millions or billions of like mosquito-like sized drones, and they take out the nuclear submarines, they take out the mobile launchers, they take out the other nukes. And anyway, so I think enormously destabilizing, enormously important for national power.
So in the past, having a technological advantage would mean 100-to-1 firepower superiority. Maybe there'll be some ratio, but more likely it will just mean a complete guaranteed win for the side that has the superior AI technology. So if you have that superiority, you win and you have zero casualties. The other side, it loses and it has as many casualties as you decide. There may not be a defense against that. They talk a bit about China's ability to build stuff, their ability to produce stuff. China's use of concrete and metal in the last 50 years, or rather in the last 20, 30 years, dwarfed anything else that we've seen in the world ever. It produces more steel than the rest of the world combined. Here's cement and steel production. The red line is China, the blue is US, here's the EU. And as they talk about here, they're in all the American labs, the AI labs, or at least they're trying to be. There's going to be billions of dollars, thousands of people, full force of this Ministry of State Security focused on one goal of infiltrating the secrets, getting the secrets, and then using the massive manufacturing ability to outbuild the US and everybody else. As Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Sam Altman, Satya Nadella, as all these people that are at the forefront of AI development, as they've pretty much all have said, the big bottleneck that we had and kind of still have is the chips, the AI chips. But the next big bottleneck that's coming will be power, electricity. Elon Musk jokes that all our transformers will need a lot more transformers on neural nets and transformers like the electrical transformers. So who's got more electricity?
Like their power in China, like the electric grid, they added a US's, a complete, they added as much power in the last decade as like sort of entire US electric grid. So like the 100 gigawatt cluster, at least the 100 gigawatts is going to be a lot easier for them to get. And so I think sort of, by this point, I think it's going to be like a extremely intense sort of international competition.
By the way, if you haven't heard, so China has this Sora competitor. So this AI text to video model, they're calling it Kling, and it's outputting some pretty stunning footage. As you can see here, side by side, comparing against Sora. This is AI. Multiple people posted this, so this is not real video. This is a AI generated video. Here's yet another one. Now again, so it's possible that some of these are fake, but there's just so many of them out there that at this point, a lot of them have to be real. They've caught up. Maybe you can say it's not quite Sora quality, but man, is it close. And it's much better than most of the other stuff that's out there. It's better than Runway, Pika, all those labs. You have to have a Chinese phone number to use it, but there's just enough of it out there that it does seem like they really, really have something. Here's another one, man eating tacos, first person shooter of some sort. Bill Smith eating spaghetti. There's a Chinese army field testing an assault rifle walking robot. Here's various robot dogs, soldiers, including ones with flamethrowers. We've played this one before. So it's this, again, robot dog with an attached machine gun of some sort. Here's the Chinese army with all kinds of gadgets, some sort of a grenade that rolls to go to where you want it to go, or maybe it's a video camera, I'm not sure. We don't know too many details into exactly what's happening, but the point is we know that both US and China are going very aggressively after this technology. We've covered this Unitree robot that is able to move around, jump up and down, has a lot of agility, is able to do a lot of the simple tasks, and it looks like it's going on sale soon, and it's not that expensive. So this is a project out of UCSD, but it is a startup that I believe has some Chinese connections, China backed. I'm not 100% sure, but the quotes for it are 90,000 to 150,000, and it might be one of the first available sort of humanoid robots available for purchase. And so the question is, when does this come to sort of a boiling point?
And at this point, companies are borrowing, hundreds of billions or more in the corporate debt markets,
But why is a CCP bureaucrat, some 60-year-old guy, he looks at this and he's like, oh, it's like Copilot has gotten better now. Why are they now?
I mean, this is much more than Copilot has gotten better now. I mean, at this point,
to them, because to shift the production of an entire country to dislocate energy that is otherwise being used for consumer goods or something, and to make it that all feed into the data centers. What will that be obvious? Because part of this whole story is you realize the super intelligence is coming soon, right? And I guess you realize it, maybe I realize it. I'm not sure how much I realize it, but will the national security apparatus in the United States and will the CCP realize it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think in some sense this is a really key question. I think we have sort of a few more years of mid-game, basically, and where you have a few more 2023s, and that just starts updating more and more people. And, I think, the trend lines, will become clear. I think you will see some amount of the sort of COVID dynamic, right? Like COVID was like, February of 2020, it's like, honestly feels a lot like today, where it's like, it feels like this really crazy thing is happening. It was about, is impending, is coming. you kind of see the exponential, and yet most of the world just doesn't realize, right? The mayor of New York is like, go out to the shows, and this is just, like Asian racism or whatever, but at some point the exponential, at some point people saw it.
A friend of mine was shorting airline and various travel cruises, Carnival cruises, like those sorts of stocks. He did very well for himself. I also saw it coming before sort of most people did, I feel like, but I stocked up on some medical stuff like hand sanitizer, thinking it would be hard to get once that whole thing hit. But apparently, no, it was toilet paper. We were supposed to stock up on toilet paper.
Just kind of crazy radical reactions came.
Right. Okay. So, by the way, what were you doing during COVID? Or when, like,
college.
February? Okay.
College, yeah.
Like freshman, sophomore, what?
Junior.
Yeah. But still, like, what were you, like 17-year-old junior or something?
Leopold graduated from college at 19 years old, so.
And then you did you short the market or something? Or?
Yeah.
Did you sell at the right time?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So there will be like a March 2020 moment, that the thing that was cool.
I think I still have some of the Costco sanitizer from 2020. Those big jugs. Let me know if you need some. I'll ship it to you.
COVID, but here. Now, then you can like make the analogy that you make in the series that this will then cause the reaction of like, we got to do the Manhattan Project for America here. I wonder what the politics of this will be like, because the difference here is it's not just like we need the bomb to beat the Nazis. It's we're building this thing that's making all our energy prices rise a bunch, and it's automating a bunch of our jobs. And the climate change stuff, like people are going to be like, oh my God, it's making climate change worse. And it's helping big tech. Politically, this doesn't seem like a dynamic where the national security apparatus or the president is like, we have to step on the gas here and like make sure America wins.
And so I'm making jokes about the hand sanitizer or whatever, but this is where I think this conversation really hits kind of like the really rough patch and the really nuanced patch. But the important thing to understand is that we had a fairly long period of relative peace in the world. But a lot of people, some people think that maybe that's coming to an end.
For the sort of like extremely intense and these extraordinary things happening in the world, and like intense international competition is like very much the historical norm. Like in some sense, it's like, there's this sort of 20-year very unique period, but like, the history of the world is like, we're kind of so used to kind of, basically peace and like, the world, American hegemony and nothing matters. But, the sort of like extremely intense and these extraordinary things happening in the world, and like intense international competition is like very much the historical norm. Like in some sense, it's like, there's this sort of 20-year very unique period, but like, the history of the world is like, like in World War II, right? It was like 50% of GDP went to, wartime production. The U.S. borrowed over 60% of GDP, in I think Germany and Japan over 100%. World War I, UK, France, Germany all borrowed over 100% of GDP. I think the sort of much more was on the line, right? Like, people talk about World War I being so destructive and, like 20 million Soviet soldiers dying and like 20% of Poland. But, that was just the sort of like that happened all the time, right? Like 7 years of war, like whatever, 20-30% of Prussia died, like 30 years of war, I think like, up to 50% of like large swath of Germany died. I think the question is, will people see that the stakes here are really, really high, and that basically sort of like history is actually back. And I think, the American national security state thinks very seriously about stuff like this. They think very seriously about competition with China. I think China very much thinks of itself on this as a historical mission and rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. A lot about national power. They think a lot about like the world order. And then, I think there's a real question on timing, right? Like, do they start taking this seriously, right? Like when the intelligence explosion was already happening, like quite late, or do they start taking this seriously like 2 years earlier? And that matters a lot for how things play out. But at some point they will. And at some point they will realize that this will be sort of utterly decisive for, not just kind of like some proxy war somewhere, but, like whether liberal democracy can continue to thrive, whether the CCP will continue existing. And I think that will activate sort of forces that we haven't seen in a long time.
It will activate forces that we haven't really seen in a long time. And again, the point of this video isn't to convince you that there's some great war coming. We don't know. My point in this video and a lot of the previous videos that I've made is that think most people are saying AI will be everything good forever, perfect utopia, versus some people are saying, AI doomers, end of the world, X risk. And those are kind of like the two options, but there's a lot more things that can happen. Superpowers seeking to remain superpowers, having world power, and whatever happens in that scenario, that's one outcome. But a dictatorship that lasts forever, one person getting power and just being able to maintain it forever, that's another possible scenario that can happen.
I had the pleasure to live in America, let's say 80 years, including dictatorships, including obviously war, famine, whatever. I was reading the Gulag Archipelago, and one of the chapters begins with Solzhenitsyn saying, if you would have told a Russian citizen under the Tsars that because of all these new technologies, we wouldn't see some great Russian revival or becomes a great power and the citizens are made wealthy, but instead what we would see is tens of millions of Soviet citizens tortured by millions of beasts in the worst possible ways, and that this is what would be the result of the 20th century, they wouldn't have believed you. They'd have called you a slanderer.
Yeah, and the possibilities for dictatorship with superintelligence are sort of even crazier, right? I think, imagine you have a perfectly loyal military and security force, right? That's it. No more rebellions, right? No more popular uprisings, perfectly loyal, you have, perfect lie detection, you have surveillance of everybody, you can perfectly figure out who's the dissenter, weed them out, no Gorbachev would have ever risen to power who had some doubts about the system, no military coup would have ever happened. And I think I think there's a real way in which, part of why things have worked out is that, ideas can evolve, and, there's sort of like some sense in which sort of time heals a lot of wounds, and time, and solves, a lot of debates, and a lot of people had really strong convictions, but, a lot of those have been overturned by time because there's been this continued pluralism and evolution. I think there's a way in which kind of like, if you take a CCP-like approach to kind of like truth is what the party said, and you supercharge that with superintelligence, I think there's a way in which that could just be like locked in and enshrined for, a long time. And I think the possibilities are pretty terrifying.
So if that kind of conversation is interesting to you, I'll link the podcast below. Definitely check it out. It's a very eye-opening, very interesting podcast where these people dig a lot deeper into what's going to happen, what could happen, the potential futures than anyone that I've really seen do before. Compared to this, I feel like a lot of the conversations are kind of almost childish. The things that we think about, we're concerned with AI stealing art or music. But I think the real questions that we're going to have to figure out are going to be a lot harder, a lot deeper than that. Now, we have to take a look at this paper that Leopold wrote. Before we do that, one last thing that they mentioned in an interview that kind of jumped out at me. Now, I don't know if this is true or not. Take this with a grain of salt, but there's a rumor that OpenAI maybe was trying to sell off AGI to the highest bidder, like whether that's Russia or China or the UAE or whatever. I wasn't sure where that originated, but here's Leopold kind of mentioning it.
Like just the companies who are going there to fundraise are like, this is the AGI is happening and you can fund it or you can't.
It's been reported that, there's been reported that, Sam is trying to raise, 7 trillion or whatever for a chip project. And, it's unclear how many of the clusters will be there and so on, but it's, definitely stuff is happening. I mean, look, I think another reason I'm a little bit, at least suspicious of this argument of like, look, if the US doesn't work with them, they'll go to China is, I've heard from multiple people, and this wasn't, from my time at OpenAI and I haven't seen the memo, but I have heard from multiple people that, at some point several years ago, OpenAI leadership had sort of laid out a plan to fund and sell AGI by starting a bidding war between the governments of, the United States, China, and Russia. And so, it's kind of surprising to me that they're willing to sell AGI to the Chinese and Russian government, but also there's something that sort of feels a bit eerily familiar about kind of starting this bidding war and then kind of like playing them off each other. And well, if you don't do this, China will do it. So anyway.
Interesting. Okay, so that's pretty fucked up.
So I don't know what to make with that. I kind of do find it hard to believe that they would be willing to sell AGI to Russia or China, not being, people that were born there or citizens of those countries, knowing what kind of power AGI would be. Seems a bit strange, but certainly we know that they have been trying to get money from the UAE, from a lot of the rich oil producing countries to fund some of these chips and some of the AI development, etc. So I really wanted to cover this situational awareness paper by Leopold, but as I was going through it, first of all, it's massive and it's very, if you scroll through it, it's very well written. He put a lot of thought into this. He put a lot of calculation into this. And I think him being from the super alignment team at OpenAI, there are a lot of things that I think it would be good to do a deep dive on. There's a lot here that needs to be looked at. But if you believe what he's saying, what his assumptions are about the growth of AI, these are some of the questions that we're going to have to answer. Ultimately, his point is that superintelligence is not going to be a San Francisco startup. It's going to be something that's more similar to the Manhattan Project, the development of the atom bomb. He says if a lab developed a literal superintelligence tomorrow, of course the feds would step in. So we'll look into this in a separate video because I think this deserves it. But I did want to highlight some things from that 4.5 hour long interview, and I do suggest you watch it for yourself. As you can tell, both those people are very well read, very intelligent, very familiar with both AI, and I was kind of surprised by the breadth of the things that they've talked about, from Solzhenitsyn to the various GDP of nations and their debt in World War I and II, to a deep dive into reinforcement learning and AI. And Leopold doesn't strike me as a crazy cult member. I believe he had some ties to EA back in the past, but it does seem like he's looking at all of the ways in which things can go wrong, not just the X risk scenario, but also understanding that we can't just pause and hope for the best forevermore. That's a silly approach, knowing that others, people perhaps with different values, could build something like this first. And we wouldn't be able to defend against it if we don't pursue our own research. Unfortunately, the race has begun, and who gets there first is going to determine a lot about where the Earth, where humanity, where the planet, where all of us, where we end up. So let me know what you think in the comments. Do you think Leopold is right? Is he wrong? Is he a kook? Is he a genius prophet of sorts? Do you think that the various nations and superpowers around the world will play nice as we approach AGI and superintelligence? Or do you think that this race will destabilize a lot of the peace and a lot of the stability that we've had? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious to know what you think. As for me, again, I'm not pushing one idea or another. I'm simply happy to see that there are people that are talking about all the possible outcomes, all the dangers. Anyways, with that said, my name is Wes Roth, and thank you for watching.